What happened after was a relatively sophisticated cover-up.
What does that mean? Does that mean that there was no massacre?
Meaning that the UN didn't have enough facts and was not able to ascertain enough facts that something actually occurred.
They saw children being killed. There were body parts in wells. The government that had just turned a corner was now perhaps complicit in crimes against humanity.
For the international community to know what's happening and not do anything, this is essentially the hallmark of complicity.
The human trafficking situation may have slowed down for now, but the conditions in Rakhine State show little signs of improvement. Worse, it seems as if the international community may be willing to accept the status quo, sacrificing the Rohingya for political expediency. Critics have alleged that the United Nations has prized maintaining good relations with the government over stopping the oppression of the Rohingya. These types of accusations against the UN are nothing new. In 2009, during the final stages of Sri Lanka's civil war, tens of thousands of civilians were killed by the army. The UN was criticized for failing to speak up and pressure the government in the lead up to the mass killings.
When people face grave violations of human rights, they expect the United Nations to act. Yet in 2012, my internal review panel assessed UN action in the final stages of armed conflict in Sri Lanka as a systemic failure.
The internal investigation concluded that there was a systemic failure at the UN due to a culture of trade-offs with the government, combined with reluctance among UN staff in Sri Lanka to stand up for the rights of people they were mandated to assist. In order to prevent something like this from happening again, the UN launched the Human Rights Upfront Initiative, which aimed to put protection of human rights above all else. Unfortunately, there are many human rights workers, including its own employees, who say that with the Rohingya, the UN is once again failing to protect vulnerable citizens, including allegedly turning a blind eye to mass atrocities in Rakhine State. We brought those allegations to the UN's resident coordinator in Myanmar, Renata Desalian.
There's been recent accusations that the UN isn't doing enough and that they're complicit in crimes against humanity and other things that are happening there. How do you respond to those allegations?
The UN is actually doing quite a lot. We're advocating for their human rights at numerous forums in Geneva, in New York, here locally. The UN is doing more than anybody else, quite frankly, in trying to address the root causes. And so I think that's a very unfair argument.
We've spoken to people in NGOs. What they're telling us is that there's a failure of the UN to push back on the government. There's sort of an appeasement process going on. And they're concerned that the systems to prevent mass atrocities aren't in place right now.
So there's no appeasement going on whatsoever. The UN works in various ways. Parts of the UN are there to stand up and call a spade, and that is exactly what's happening. I don't think anyone has spoken out as loudly as the UN on rights violations and unacceptable situation in Rakhine State. So there's absolutely no complicity whatsoever.
However, Vice News got a hold of leaked internal documents, including emails and a resignation letter of a mid-level official that show UN employees with mounting concerns about UN inaction, with some even questioning whether the UN is complicit in crimes against humanity. We asked Matt Smith to help walk us through the leaked documents and what they mean for the Rohingya.
What do you make of the tone of these documents?
The fact that there is accurate information that has been communicated and transmitted up the information food chain among some of these agencies is significant because it demonstrates that people do, or at least should know, what's actually going on and what's been going on for decades. There's no lack of information about what's happening. The response is the real issue. And there are people who are in positions to influence the situation in Rakhine State. And not only are they not doing it, but in some cases, they've actually made the situation worse. These agencies want to stay within the good graces of the Myanmar authorities, and there's nothing wrong with that. They should be working with the authorities. The problem comes when there are these severe abuses taking place, when atrocity crimes are taking place, and there's inaction.
An internal review addressed the UN's silence and inaction in Myanmar. And in one email, a UN employee writes, "I am trying to be constructive in a discussion of potential risk of us being complicit to the commission of crimes against humanity." In another document, an employee raises alarm bells, saying, "I'm extremely concerned about a repeat of the systemic failures by the UN to prevent large-scale violence as we have witnessed before."
What do you think is behind this negligence from the UN and these agencies in terms of putting pressure on the government?
There's a great amount of fear among and between agencies that are operational in Myanmar. Fear that they will be evicted, like MSF, Doctors Without Borders was evicted.
In 2014, Doctors Without Borders, or MSF, a nonprofit medical humanitarian organization, was forced out of the country after it said it treated 22 people for injuries and wounds in Duchi Yardan, a village in Rakhine State where a massacre is alleged to have occurred with the participation of local authorities. The government refuted the statements, all the while refusing to allow an independent investigation and denying that a massacre occurred. The Duchi Yardan incident is a disturbing mystery, in which it is alleged that dozens of Rohingya were killed, including women and children, with the help of local authorities. 8,000 people fled the area, but no bodies were ever found. The government did its own investigations, concluding that no massacre occurred. But there are many who disagree with the government's findings.
At any given time, I was the most senior human rights officer in the country and focused on Rakhine State.
Michael Sheikh worked for the UN at the time and is the only international observer to gain access to the area in the aftermath of the incident. This is the first time he has spoken to the media about what happened.
Can you tell us what you saw?
I saw some very traumatized people who explained some very terrible things that had happened. Killings, they saw children being killed. They explained that there were body parts in wells. It was very clear that people had experienced something very traumatic. Tens and tens of eyewitnesses who had claimed that this had happened.
So you took your findings to the UN, and what happened after that?
We delivered it to the Myanmar government, saying these are some very serious allegations we're hearing. You have the responsibility to investigate these things. The government vociferously denied that anything was happening. Only the military and only the police were able to go in and go out. There were travel bans. You couldn't move north and south on one of these roads. It provided perfect opportunity to scrub the area for nearly 2 weeks.
A cover-up.
Yeah, effectively, yes.
We received information at the time that there were a number of killings taking place in Duchi Yardan. What happened after was a relatively sophisticated cover-up that successfully influenced the thinking not only of the diplomatic community, but also senior UN officials, including at the UN headquarters in New York. There was a lot of disagreement within the UN about what did and did not take place in Duchi Yardan.
Despite the detailed UN report citing numerous eyewitness accounts, Sheikh says UN higher-ups were persuaded by the government's denials.
So essentially what happened, the UN sort of walked back this report and stopped putting pressure on the government?
Yes, that's what happened. It prioritized its relationship with the government over the people that it was in the business of protecting.
UN employees like Sheikh, who wanted to press the government for an independent investigation, and who were concerned with the way that the narrative was being altered, were silenced and intimidated by their superiors. In the leaked resignation letter, a mid-level official states she was told by her supervisor to never raise this with her or anyone else if you want to continue your career in the UN. "I was instructed to rewrite history," she states.
You know, we've seen internal documents, including emails and resignation letter, that are saying that people who were speaking up about what happened in Duchi Yardan and what's happening to the Rohingya were effectively being silenced or intimidated to stay quiet. Is that something you experienced as well?
Yeah, I not just with Duchi Yardan. Prior to Duchi Yardan, after Duchi Yardan, it got much worse, I'll be clear. When you're talking about very nasty human rights abuses, it makes dialogue much more difficult. And what we see in UN is that the leadership there doesn't want to have these frank and difficult discussions. They'd rather sideline them. They'd rather prioritize their relationship with the government and push aside those that have the facts.
We've seen, some documents that were given to us about internal UN sort of dissents, and from what some of the people that have worked here have told us is that they feel like the voices that are raising concern about this are being suppressed or forced out, and that there really isn't that much being done. Can you go into detail about what happened with Duchi Yartan, why that was a controversy, and why the UN walked back on having an international investigation done?
There were deep concerns about an incident that was very, very upsetting for everybody. Subsequent to that incident, it appears that some of the allegations that were made do not appear to have been substantiated. So I think that it's unfair to say that the UN backed away from calling for an investigation. The information that we subsequently learned didn't corroborate the initial allegations that were made.
Meaning that they don't think any sort of massacre occurred, there was no violence, there was no... What does that mean?
Meaning that the UN didn't have enough facts and was not able to ascertain enough facts that something actually occurred as alleged.
Even though MSF said that people were being treated for trauma and things along that?
We understand that something happened, and we understand people were treated for trauma, but there's a big difference between that and some of the allegations that were...
But doesn't that call for an international investigation of some sorts?
Well, there were, as I understand it, inadequate information to proceed along those lines.
Vice News confirmed that the UN sent its staff back to the Duchi Yartan area 2 weeks after it submitted its initial report to collect additional information. What they found corroborated the initial findings that pointed to alleged mass atrocities.
The UN and others were trying to make up for a disastrous moral failure in Sri Lanka and saw Myanmar as a mea culpa, that if they got Myanmar right, it could absolve them from the sins in Sri Lanka. There is a real desire to get it right in Myanmar, but the desire to get it right also prevented from people from looking at reality. This culture of we need to get it right, and if we challenge the government too much, it could ruin that relationship, but also challenge our good news story that we've been telling ourselves and telling the world. The government that had just turned a corner was now perhaps complicit in crimes against humanity.
It would ruin the narrative.
It would ruin the narrative, yeah, absolutely. And that narrative was too valuable to be tarnished.
The good news narrative of Myanmar got a huge boost on March 30th, when Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy party were sworn into office, ushering in a new era. There's a lot of hope that reforms will continue as the country further transitions to democracy. Rohingyas in the camps themselves told us that they think things will change for the better with the NLD now in power. But the reality is that little has been done or even proposed with regard to the Rohingya.
Great things are happening in Myanmar, but Rakhine State is a festering wound on that progress.
The newly elected NLD has said that the situation in Rakhine State is not a priority. Even Aung San Suu Kyi, a Nobel Peace Prize winner and a darling of the international community, has been mostly silent when it comes to speaking up for the Rohingya.
There is evidence that they have been systematically targeted.
Muslims have been targeted, but also Buddhists have been subjected to violence. But there's fear on both sides, and so there's this fear.
Fear on both sides. You would accept, though, that the scale of the suffering is not equal on both sides. There are something like 140,000 Burmese Muslims displaced from their homes and living in camps. They're the ones who are bearing the brunt of this violence.
I think there are many, many Buddhists who have also left the country for various reasons, and there are many Buddhists who are in refugee camps.
We hear about this positive relationship now that the US has with Myanmar, that the UK has with Myanmar, and it seems like there's this out in the open ethnic cleansing that's happening, and meanwhile, it doesn't seem like much is being done.
Some people have essentially been intoxicated by this romantic narrative that democratic change is sweeping through the country and that the situation will necessarily turn out great for all populations in Myanmar. And I think part of the reason why the international community has not done more is because there are certain political and economic incentives to not having these inconvenient conversations with senior government officials. And for the international community to know what's happening and not do anything, this is essentially the hallmark of complicity.